Hey there, I'm Carl. I've been a local newspaper columnist in this city for over 30 years, and let me tell you, I've seen it all. From heartwarming tales of community heroes to shocking scandals that rocked our town to its core. I've covered everything from the Great Flood of '95 to that time the mayor's dog won the annual hot dog eating contest. But I don't just write any old story. I've got a nose for the ones that really matter, the ones with lessons that stick with you long after you've finished reading. Now, let me tell you about a story that'll make your jaw drop. It's called Racist Chinese Thugs Pick on Wrong Black Teen. You won't believe what happens next. Face screaming in fear, this tale I'm about to share? It's a doozy that'll make you think twice about judging a book by its cover. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let me fill you in on what went down. Trust me, you won't want to miss this one. And hey, once you've heard this story, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your friends and family. You never know, it might just open someone's eyes or even save them from making a big mistake. Let's spread the word and make our community a little bit wiser, one story at a time. Stay tuned, folks, this is going to be a wild ride. Chapter 1. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath echoing through the packed school gymnasium. Wei, the leader of the notorious Dragons gang, lay sprawled on the floor, his face contorted in pain. His cronies, usually so intimidating, were frozen in shock. Standing over him, fists clenched, was Jamal, a lanky black teenager known more for his quiet demeanor and love of books than any fighting prowess. But something had clearly snapped in Jamal that day. His eyes blazed with a fury no one had ever seen before, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. No one dared to move. Had Jamal, the bookworm, actually just taken down Wei, the toughest kid in school? And what would happen next? Was this the start of an all-out brawl? To understand how this unlikely scene unfolded, we need to rewind a bit. It all started a few weeks earlier, with the arrival of a new student. Jamal Johnson was the new kid in town. His family had moved from a bustling city to this quiet suburban neighborhood, and Jamal was finding it hard to adjust. He missed his old friends, his basketball team, and the familiar rhythm of his old life. Here, he felt like an outsider, a lone brown face in a sea of white. He tried to make friends, of course. He joined the school library club, hoping to find some like-minded souls. He even tried out for the basketball team, but the other guys mostly ignored him. It seemed like he was invisible, except to Wei and his gang. Wei and his dragons were the school's self-proclaimed rulers. They roamed the hallways like they owned the place, picking on smaller kids, disrupting classes, and generally making life miserable for anyone who wasn't in their inner circle. They were loud, arrogant, and unfortunately for Jamal, racist. It started with snide comments in the hallways. "Hey look, it's Kobe Bryant," they'd sneer, or they'd make monkey noises whenever Jamal walked by. Jamal tried to ignore them, but their taunts grew bolder each day. They'd trip him in the cafeteria, shove him against lockers, and even steal his books, scattering the pages across the hallway. Jamal was a peaceful guy. He believed in turning the other cheek, in rising above the pettiness. But the dragon's relentless bullying was starting to wear him down. He felt a growing anger simmering inside him, a frustration that threatened to boil over. One day, as Jamal was walking home from school, the dragons cornered him in an alleyway. Wei, a stocky boy with a sneer permanently etched on his face, blocked his path. Well, look who it is," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Lost your way, jungle boy?" His cronies, two lanky boys named Jean and Feng, snickered behind him. Wei stepped closer, his face inches from Jamal's. "You know, we don't take kindly to your kind around here," he hissed. "So why don't you just scram back to where you came from?" Jamal stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "Just leave me alone," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Or what?" Wei taunted, shoving Jamal's shoulder. "What are you gonna do about it?" Jamal clenched his fists, trying to control the rage that was building inside him. He knew he couldn't fight them, not 3 against 1. But he also knew he couldn't just stand there and take it anymore. "I'm warning you," Jamal said, his voice low and dangerous. "Just back off." Wei laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Oh, I'm so scared," he said, clutching his chest dramatically. Then, his face hardened. "You wanna fight, huh? Fine. Meet us in the gym after school tomorrow. Let's see what you're made of." Jamal's stomach churned. He'd never been in a fight before. He wasn't a violent person. But something inside him snapped. He was tired of being bullied, tired of being scared. "Fine," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'll be there." The next day, the school gymnasium was packed. News of the fight had spread like wildfire, and everyone wanted to see what would happen. The dragons, surrounded by their usual entourage, swaggered into the gym, their faces filled with smug confidence. Jamal walked in alone, his head held high, a look of grim determination in his eyes. The fight was brutal and swift. Jamal, fueled by years of pent-up anger and frustration, fought like a man possessed. He dodged Wei's punches, landed a few of his own, and before anyone knew what was happening, Wei was on the ground, clutching his stomach and gasping for air. The crowd was stunned into silence. No one had expected this. Jamal, the quiet, bookish kid, had just taken down the school bully. But what they didn't know was that Jamal had a secret that would explain his sudden burst of strength and fighting skills. The silence in the gym was deafening. Everyone stared at Jamal, their eyes wide with disbelief. Wei, still groaning on the floor, looked up at Jamal with a mixture of fear and astonishment. His cronies, Jean and Feng, hovered nearby, unsure of what to do. Jamal stood over Wei, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. He felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins, a strange mix of triumph and fear. He had never been in a fight before, and he had never imagined he was capable of such violence. But something inside him had snapped, and he had unleashed a fury he didn't know he possessed. The crowd started to murmur, their whispers filling the gym. "Did he just win?" someone asked incredulously. "How did he do that?" another whispered. Jamal, still catching his breath, looked around the gym, his eyes meeting the stunned faces of his classmates. He saw a flicker of admiration in some of their eyes, a hint of respect that he had never seen before. He also saw fear, especially in the eyes of the dragon's usual followers. Suddenly, a voice cut through the murmurs. "What's going on here?" It was Mr. Henderson, the school principal, his face red with anger. He pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes fixed on Jamal. "Johnson, what is the meaning of this?" he boomed, his voice echoing through the gym. Jamal hesitated, unsure of what to say. He knew fighting was wrong, but he also knew he couldn't just let Wei and his gang continue to bully him. Before Jamal could answer, Wei scrambled to his feet, his face contorted in pain. "He attacked me, Mr. Henderson," he whined, pointing a trembling finger at Jamal. "He just started hitting me for no reason." Jean and Feng chimed in, their voices high-pitched and eager. "Yeah, he's a crazy psycho," Jean yelled. "He just went nuts," Feng added. Mr. Henderson glared at Jamal, his expression hardening. "Is this true, Johnson?" he asked, his voice stern. "Did you attack Wei?" Jamal felt a surge of frustration. He knew he was in trouble, but he also knew he couldn't tell the truth. If he admitted that Wei and his gang had been bullying him, he would be labeled a snitch, and things would only get worse. I. He stammered, unsure of what to say. Mr. Henderson shook his head in disappointment. "I am very disappointed in you, Johnson," he said. "Fighting is never the answer. You are both suspended for a week, and I expect to see you both in my office first thing Monday morning." Jamal felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had finally stood up for himself, but it had only gotten him into more trouble. He walked out of the gym, his head down, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. As he walked home, Jamal replayed the events of the day in his mind. He couldn't believe he had actually fought Wei. He had never considered himself a fighter, but something inside him had changed. He felt a newfound sense of confidence, a sense of power that he had never experienced before. He also felt a pang of guilt. He knew he shouldn't have resorted to violence, but he also knew he couldn't just let Wei and his gang continue to bully him. He had tried to ignore them, to rise above their taunts, but it had only made things worse. As he reached his house, Jamal made a decision. He would no longer be a victim. He would no longer let fear control him. He would stand up for himself, no matter the cost. He walked into the house, his head held high, a new determination in his eyes. He knew he had a long way to go, but he also knew he was finally on the right path. He went to his room and started practicing his punches and kicks. He remembered the moves his grandfather, a former military veteran, had taught him years ago. He practiced for hours, his body aching, his sweat soaking his clothes. He knew he couldn't rely on violence to solve all his problems, but he also knew he needed to be prepared to defend himself. He wouldn't let anyone bully him again. The next day, Jamal went to the library and checked out a book on martial arts. He spent the rest of the week studying the book, learning new techniques, and practicing his moves. He felt a sense of purpose, a sense of control that he had never felt before. On Monday morning, Jamal went to Mr. Henderson's office, his heart pounding in his chest. He was nervous, but he was also determined to tell his side of the story. He walked into the office and saw Wei sitting in a chair, his face sullen. Mr. Henderson looked up from his desk, his expression stern. "Johnson," he said, his voice grave. "I have been reviewing the security footage from the gym, and I am not happy with what I saw." Jamal's heart sank. He knew he was in trouble. "It is clear from the footage that you initiated the fight," Mr. Henderson continued. "You attacked Wei without provocation." Jamal opened his mouth to protest, but Mr. Henderson held up a hand. "I understand that you may have felt provoked," he said, "but that does not excuse your actions. Violence is never the answer." Jamal felt a surge of frustration. He wanted to explain that Wei and his gang had been bullying him for weeks, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Mr. Henderson had already made up his mind. "I am extending your suspension to 2 weeks, Mr. Henderson said. "And I am also assigning you to after-school detention for the rest of the semester." Jamal felt a wave of despair wash over him. He had tried to do the right thing, but it had only gotten him into more trouble. He walked out of the office, his head down, feeling defeated. As he walked home, Jamal felt a familiar anger building inside him. He was tired of being punished for defending himself. He was tired of being the victim. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He would not let this break him. He would not let them win. He would find a way to fight back, a way to make them pay. He just didn't know how yet. But he would figure it out. He had to. The 2-week suspension felt like an eternity. Jamal spent most of it in his room, reading, practicing his martial arts, and brooding. He felt a deep sense of injustice. He had been punished for defending himself against bullies, while those bullies walked free. It just didn't seem fair. His parents, bless their hearts, tried to be supportive. His dad, a quiet but strong man, encouraged him to focus on his studies and not let the incident get him down. His mom, always the nurturer, fussed over him, making sure he ate properly and got enough rest. But they didn't truly understand the depth of his frustration and anger. The first day back at school was nerve-wracking. As he walked through the hallways, he felt all eyes on him. Some students whispered and pointed, while others avoided his gaze altogether. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken question hanging over him. Would he retaliate against Wei and the dragons? Wei and his gang, however, seemed emboldened by their victory. They strutted through the hallways with even more arrogance than before, their laughter echoing through the corridors. They even started wearing matching dragon t-shirts, a blatant display of their gang affiliation. Jamal tried to ignore them, but their taunts were relentless. They called him names, bumped into him in the hallways, and even threw things at him in the cafeteria. He felt like he was back to square one, trapped in a cycle of bullying and fear. One afternoon, as Jamal was leaving school, he saw Wei and his gang gathered around a younger student. The boy, small and skinny, was cowering against the lockers, his face pale with fear. Wei was shouting at him, his face inches from the boys, while Jean and Feng snickered and shoved the boys' books to the floor. Something inside Jamal snapped. He couldn't just stand there and watch another innocent person get bullied. He marched over to the group, his heart pounding in his chest. "Leave him alone," Jamal said, his voice firm. Wei turned around, his face contorted in surprise. Well, look who it is," he sneered. "The mighty warrior has returned." Jean and Feng erupted in laughter. "What are you gonna do, Johnson?" Jean taunted. "Beat us all up." Jamal ignored them and focused on Wei. "I said, leave him alone," he repeated, his voice rising. Wei stepped closer, his eyes narrowed. "Or what?" he challenged. "You gonna hit me again? Go ahead, I dare you." Jamal hesitated. He knew that fighting would only get him into more trouble. But he also knew he couldn't just walk away. He had to do something. He took a deep breath and said, "I'm not going to hit you. But I'm not going to let you bully this kid either." Wei laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Oh really?" he said. "And what are you going to do about it?" Jamal glanced around the hallway. Students were watching the confrontation, their faces filled with curiosity and apprehension. He knew he had to do something dramatic, something that would show Wei and his gang that he wasn't afraid of them. He looked Wei straight in the eye and said, "I'm going to challenge you to a duel." The hallway fell silent. Wei's face went blank, then his lips curled into a sneer. "A duel," he scoffed. "What are you talking about?" "A duel," Jamal repeated, his voice steady. "We'll meet after school tomorrow, in the park. No weapons, just hand-to-hand combat. The winner gets to decide what happens to the loser." Wei's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. He had thought Jamal would back down, but the kid was actually challenging him to a fight. In public, Jean and Feng exchanged nervous glances. They had seen what Jamal was capable of, and they weren't sure Wei could win. Wei, however, couldn't back down now. Not in front of his cronies, not in front of the whole school. He had to accept the challenge. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "A duel it is. Be there or be square." Jamal nodded. "I'll be there," he said. He turned and walked away, leaving Wei and his gang standing in stunned silence. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a mix of fear and excitement. He had just thrown down the gauntlet, and he had no idea what would happen next. The news of the duel spread through the school like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone was talking about it. The air crackled with anticipation. Would Jamal actually show up? Could he really defeat Wei in a fair fight? Or was this just a desperate bluff? Jamal himself was a bundle of nerves. He had never been one for confrontation, and the thought of facing Wei in front of an audience terrified him. But he had made a promise, and he wasn't going to back down. After school, he headed to the park, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Wei already there, surrounded by his usual entourage. A crowd of students had gathered around them, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Wei, sensing the attention, puffed out his chest and smirked. Well, looks like you actually showed up," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Ready to get your butt kicked?" Jamal ignored the taunt and stepped forward, his eyes locked on Wei's. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He knew he couldn't let fear control him. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice steady. The crowd parted, forming a circle around the two boys. A hush fell over the park as everyone waited with bated breath. Wei lunged forward, throwing a wild punch. Jamal dodged easily and countered with a swift kick to Wei's leg. Wei stumbled back, surprised by Jamal's agility. They circled each other, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Wei threw another punch, but Jamal blocked it and landed a jab to Wei's jaw. Wei staggered back, his face contorted in pain. The crowd gasped. It was clear that Jamal was not just defending himself, he was actually winning. Wei, used to intimidating his opponents with his size and aggression, was now on the defensive. Frustration and anger fueled Wei's next attack. He charged at Jamal, throwing a flurry of punches. Jamal dodged most of them, but one connected with his cheek, sending him reeling. The crowd roared. Wei, sensing an opportunity, pressed his advantage. He pushed Jamal against a tree, raining blows on his head and shoulders. Jamal tried to block, but Wei was relentless. Just when it seemed like Jamal was about to go down, he remembered his grandfather's training. He ducked under Wei's punch, grabbed his arm, and flipped him over his shoulder. Wei landed on the ground with a thud, the air knocked out of him. The crowd erupted in cheers. Jamal stood over Wei, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. Wei lay on the ground, gasping for air, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Jamal had won. He looked around at the cheering crowd, a sense of triumph washing over him. He had faced his fear, stood up to his bully, and emerged victorious. He had proven that he wasn't just a bookworm, he was a fighter. He extended a hand to Wei, who hesitated for a moment before taking it. Jamal pulled him to his feet. "It's over," Jamal said, his voice firm but calm. "No more bullying. No more intimidation. Leave me and everyone else alone." Wei, still reeling from his defeat, nodded silently. He knew he had been beaten, not just physically, but also in spirit. The crowd parted as Jamal walked away, his head held high. He felt a new sense of confidence, a new sense of power. He had overcome his fear, and he had discovered a strength he never knew he possessed. As he walked home, he couldn't help but smile. He had won the duel, but more importantly, he had won his freedom. He was no longer a victim, he was a survivor. But as he turned the corner onto his street, he noticed a sleek black car parked across from his house. Two men in dark suits stood beside the car, their faces grim. They watched him approach, their eyes cold and calculating. Jamal's heart sank. He had a feeling this was just the beginning of a much bigger problem. Jamal slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. The men's presence sent a shiver down his spine. They looked out of place in his quiet suburban neighborhood, like predators lurking in the shadows. As he got closer, one of the men stepped forward, his face etched with a stern expression. He was tall and imposing, with broad shoulders and a shaved head. The other man remained by the car, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Jamal. "Jamal Johnson," the first man asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Jamal nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Yes. We need to talk to you," the man said. "About the incident at the park." Jamal's heart sank. He had hoped the fight with Wei would be the end of it, but it seemed he was wrong. These men, with their serious expressions and intimidating demeanor, clearly weren't there to congratulate him on his victory. "Who are you?" Jamal asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That's not important," the man said dismissively. "What is important is that you understand the seriousness of your actions." Jamal frowned. "What do you mean?" "You assaulted Wei Chun," the man said, his voice hardening. "He's the son of a very influential businessman. A man who does not take kindly to his son being humiliated in public." Jamal felt a surge of anger. "He was bullying me," he protested. "He and his gang have been tormenting me for weeks." The man's expression remained unchanged. "That's not our concern," he said coldly. "Our concern is that you caused harm to Mr. Chen's son. And there will be consequences." Jamal felt a wave of fear wash over him. He had no idea who these men were or what they were capable of, but their threats were chilling. He had thought he had escaped the dragon's clutches, but it seemed he had stumbled into something far more dangerous. "What do you want?" Jamal asked, his voice trembling. "We want you to apologize," the man said. "Publicly. To Wei Chun and his family. And we want you to promise that you will never lay a hand on him again." Jamal's jaw clenched. He had fought hard to defend himself, and now these men were demanding he grovel at Wei's feet? It was unthinkable. "I won't do it," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. The man's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "Mr. Chun is a powerful man. He can make your life very difficult." "I don't care," Jamal said, his voice rising. "I'm not going to be bullied by him or anyone else." The man sighed. "So be it," he said. "You've been warned." He turned and walked back to the car, followed by his companion. They got in and drove away, leaving Jamal standing on the sidewalk, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched the car disappear down the street, a sense of dread creeping over him. He had defied these men, and he knew they wouldn't take it lightly. He had no idea what they would do next, but he knew he had to be prepared. He walked into the house, his mind racing. He told his parents about the encounter, and they were understandably worried. His dad suggested contacting the police, but Jamal wasn't sure that would do any good. These men seemed to operate outside the law, and he doubted the police would be able to protect him. He spent the next few days on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting trouble at every turn. He avoided going out alone, and he even started carrying a small pocket knife for protection. One evening, as he was walking home from the library, he noticed a car following him. He quickened his pace, but the car kept pace. He tried to lose it by taking a shortcut through an alleyway, but the car followed him. He emerged from the alleyway onto a quiet street, his heart pounding in his chest. The car pulled up beside him, and the window rolled down. It was the same man who had confronted him outside his house. "Get in," the man said, his voice cold and commanding. Jamal hesitated. He knew he shouldn't get in the car, but he also knew he couldn't outrun them. He glanced around the deserted street, hoping for help, but there was no one in sight. He took a deep breath and got in the car. The man drove in silence, his face grim. Jamal sat beside him, his hands clenched in his lap, his mind racing. Where were they taking him? What were they going to do to him? The car pulled up in front of a large, imposing building. It was a Chinese restaurant, but unlike any Jamal had ever seen before. It was ornate and opulent, with red lanterns hanging from the eaves and golden dragons adorning the entrance. The man led Jamal inside, through a dimly lit hallway, and into a private room. The room was lavishly decorated, with silk tapestries on the walls and a large mahogany table in the center. Seated at the table was an older man, his face stern and weathered. He wore a traditional Chinese robe, and his fingers were adorned with jade rings. "This is Mr. Chun," the man said. "He wants to talk to you." Jamal's heart sank. He was face to face with the powerful man whose son he had humiliated. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't be good. Mr. Chun studied Jamal with an intensity that made him squirm. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to bore into Jamal's very soul. The silence in the room was thick with tension, broken only by the faint clinking of teacups from the adjoining room. Finally, Mr. Chun spoke, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Jamal Johnson," he began, "I understand you had an altercation with my son Wei." Jamal nodded, his gaze fixed on the ornate tablecloth. He felt a strange mix of fear and defiance. He knew he was in trouble, but he also knew he wouldn't apologize for defending himself. "I have seen the security footage from the park," Mr. Chun continued, his voice still calm. "And I must say, I was impressed by your skills." Jamal looked up in surprise. He hadn't expected a compliment from the man whose son he had defeated. "You are a strong young man," Mr. Chun said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "But strength without discipline is like a wild horse, powerful, but unpredictable." Jamal frowned. He wasn't sure where this was going. Was Mr. Chun trying to intimidate him with cryptic proverbs? "I understand you have been experiencing difficulties with my son and his associates," Mr. Chun said, his voice hardening slightly. "I apologize for their behavior. They have been misguided." Jamal was taken aback. He had expected anger, threats, maybe even violence. But an apology? From the powerful Mr. Chun? However, Mr. Chun continued, his voice regaining its sternness, "I cannot condone violence. You attacked my son in public, causing him humiliation and injury. This cannot go unpunished." Jamal's heart sank. He knew the other shoe was about to drop. "But," Mr. Chun said, pausing for effect, "I believe in second chances. I believe in redemption." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Jamal's. "I have a proposition for you, Jamal Johnson. A way to make amends for your actions, and perhaps even learn something valuable in the process." Jamal's curiosity was piqued. "What kind of proposition?" he asked cautiously. Mr. Chun smiled, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. "I would like you to train with me," he said. Jamal stared at him in disbelief. "Train? With you?" "Yes," Mr. Chun said, his smile widening. "I am a master of Kung Fu, a traditional Chinese martial art. I believe you have potential, Jamal. Raw talent that needs to be honed and disciplined." Jamal was speechless. He had always been fascinated by martial arts, but he had never had the opportunity to learn them properly. And now Mr. Chun, the father of his bully, was offering to teach him? "Why?" Jamal finally managed to ask. "Why would you want to train me?" Mr. Chen's smile softened. "I see a fire in you, Jamal," he said. "A passion that needs to be channeled. I believe I can help you control that fire, to use it for good instead of destruction." He paused, his eyes twinkling. "Besides," he added, "it would be a shame to waste such talent." Jamal felt a surge of excitement. This was an opportunity he couldn't refuse. Not only would he learn Kung Fu from a master, but he would also gain a powerful ally in Mr. Chun. "I accept," he said, his voice filled with newfound determination. Mr. Chun nodded, his smile widening. "Excellent," he said. "Training begins tomorrow. Be here at dawn." Jamal left the restaurant that night with a mix of trepidation and excitement. He had no idea what to expect from this training, but he knew it would be a challenge. And he was ready to face it head-on. He arrived at the restaurant the next morning before the sun had even risen. Mr. Chun was already waiting for him, dressed in a simple white training uniform. He led Jamal to a hidden courtyard behind the restaurant, a tranquil oasis amidst the bustling city. The training was rigorous. Mr. Chun pushed Jamal to his limits, demanding precision and discipline in every move. He taught Jamal not only the physical techniques of Kung Fu, but also the mental and spiritual aspects of the art. Jamal learned to control his anger, to channel his energy, and to focus his mind. He learned about respect, honor, and self-discipline. He learned that true strength comes not from brute force, but from inner peace and balance. As the weeks passed, Jamal grew stronger, both physically and mentally. He developed a deep respect for Mr. Chun, who became not just his teacher, but also a mentor and friend. He also learned more about Mr. Chen's past, about his struggles and triumphs, about his deep love for his family and his culture. He began to understand the complex dynamics between Mr. Chen and his son Wei. One day, after a particularly grueling training session, Mr. Chen turned to Jamal, a serious expression on his face. "Jamal," he said, "I have something important to tell you." Jamal looked at him, his heart pounding. He had a feeling this was about to change everything. Jamal felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Mr. Chen's serious tone and the intense look in his eyes told him this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Wei, he's not my biological son," Mr. Chen said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Jamal was stunned. He had never suspected, never even considered that Wei might be adopted. It explained so much, the strained relationship between them, the lack of resemblance, even Wei's desperate need to prove himself. His parents, they were dear friends of mine, Mr. Chen continued, his gaze distant, lost in memories. They were killed in a tragic accident when Wei was just a baby. I promised them I would take care of him, raise him as my own. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. I tried my best, Jamal. I truly did. But Wei, he's always felt like an outsider. He resents me, resents his heritage, resents everything I stand for. Mr. Chen looked at Jamal, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. He's angry, Jamal. Angry at the world, angry at his fate. And he takes it out on those he perceives as weaker than himself. Jamal nodded slowly, understanding dawning on him. Wei's bullying, his cruelty, it all stemmed from a deep-seated insecurity, a desperate need to belong. I brought you here, Jamal, Mr. Chen said, his voice regaining its strength, because I see something in you. You are strong, yes, but you are also kind and compassionate. You have a good heart, Jamal. And I believe you can help Wei. Jamal frowned. Help him? How? By being his friend, Mr. Chen said simply. By showing him that there's more to life than anger and resentment. By showing him that he can be accepted for who he is, not for who he pretends to be. Jamal hesitated. He had every reason to hate Wei, to despise him for the way he had treated him. But he also understood the pain and insecurity that fueled Wei's actions. And he knew that Mr. Chen was right. Wei needed a friend, someone who could see past his tough exterior and connect with the vulnerable boy hiding within. I'll try, Jamal said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. Mr. Chen smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. Thank you, Jamal, he said. I knew I could count on you. From that day on, Jamal made a conscious effort to reach out to Wei. It wasn't easy. Wei was still wary, still prone to outbursts of anger and resentment. But Jamal persisted, patiently chipping away at Wei's defenses. He invited Wei to train with him, sharing the skills and knowledge he had learned from Mr. Chen. He listened to Wei's frustrations, offering support and understanding without judgment. He showed Wei, through his actions and words, that he genuinely cared. Slowly but surely, Wei began to open up. He started to see Jamal not as an enemy, but as a friend, a confidant. He began to appreciate the strength and discipline of Kung Fu, the way it helped him channel his anger and focus his energy. He even started to show respect for his Chinese heritage, learning about his ancestors, their traditions, and their values. He began to understand that his identity wasn't defined by his past, but by the choices he made in the present. The transformation wasn't overnight. There were setbacks, moments of anger and frustration. But with Jamal's unwavering support and Mr. Chen's guidance, Wei slowly but surely found his way. He apologized to Jamal for his past behavior, a sincere apology that came from the heart. He even started standing up to his old gang, the Dragons, refusing to participate in their bullying and intimidation tactics. The change in Wei was remarkable. He became more confident, more compassionate, more at peace with himself. He even started excelling in school, discovering a passion for history and literature. Jamal and Wei became inseparable friends, their bond forged through shared struggles and mutual respect. They trained together, studied together, and even started a Kung Fu club at school, teaching other students the art of self-defense and self-discipline. The story of Jamal and Wei became a legend in their community, a testament to the power of friendship, understanding, and forgiveness. It showed that even the most bitter enemies could find common ground, that even the most hardened hearts could be softened by compassion. And as for Jamal, he learned that true strength comes not from defeating your enemies, but from helping them become your friends. He learned that the best way to fight hate is with love, and that the most powerful weapon of all is the human heart.